There is a detail buried in hundreds of abduction accounts that almost nobody talks about. Not the paralysis, not the examination tables, not even the missing time. It's this. Some abductees report watching another person be taken to a separate room, and that person never came back. Not to the ship, not to Earth, not ever. The witnesses returned, the others didn't. And the question nobody seems to be asking is, what happened in the seconds before that separation? What did the extraterrestrials see? What did they decide? And why that person, and not the one standing right next to them? I want to start with a number. Thousands. That is the rough estimate of documented abduction cases worldwide. Thousands of individuals across 6 decades who claim to have been taken by non-human beings, subjected to procedures they cannot fully explain, and then returned to their beds, their cars, their fields, their lives, disoriented, changed, but back. Now, I want to start with a different number. Nobody knows it. That's the number of people who were taken and never returned. We don't know it because the only witnesses are the ones who came back. And the ones who didn't, well, by definition, they can't tell us anything. They are the silence at the centre of this entire subject. And that silence, the more I examined it, became impossible to ignore. The famous cases, Betty and Barney Hill, Travis Walton, Whitley Strieber, these provide useful framework. But the mainstream cases are too well known, too analysed, too cleaned up by years of media exposure and narrative shaping. The accounts I find most revealing are the obscure ones, the ones filed with regional UFO research groups in the 1970s and 1980s that never made it into books, the ones transcribed during hypnotic regression sessions in rural clinics in Brazil, in farmhouses in rural England, in a community centre outside Tucson in 1987. These accounts have a rawness to them, an unpolished quality that paradoxically makes certain details stand out with terrible clarity. One such account comes from a woman I'll call MR, her actual initials, whose case was documented by researcher Bud Hopkins but never included in any of his published works. Hopkins noted her case in a private correspondence dated 1989, a letter to a colleague describing it as one of the most disturbing ancillary accounts I have encountered. M.R. reported being taken from her home in a suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, sometime in the late autumn of 1981. She was not alone in the experience. She described at least 4 other individuals present in what she called the holding area, a large curved room bathed in ambient light with no visible source. 2 of these individuals she recognised, vaguely, though she couldn't say from where. 2 were strangers. She described the beings moving through the room with what she called a kind of organised efficiency. Not random, not frantic, deliberate, purposeful. And then she described something that stopped me cold when I first read it. They came for each of us separately, she told Hopkins. They would take one person and they would bring that person back after some time. You could tell the person would come back different, quieter, like they'd been emptied somehow. They came back. But there was one man, older, maybe 60, grey at the temples. They took him and there was a change. You could feel it. When they brought him back into the room, it wasn't to return him to where he'd been sitting. They guided him to a corridor on the far side, a different corridor, and he looked at me as he passed, just looked, and I thought, he knows he isn't going home. M.R. returned that night. The man, to her knowledge, did not. What specific event triggered his rerouting? And what had the beings observed or measured during his individual session that prompted the decision to redirect him to a different corridor? To understand what may constitute the moment of selection, we first have to understand what abduction procedures look like in their standard form, because it's the deviations from that standard form that appear to signal the shift. Across hundreds of cases, the procedural sequence reported during abductions follows a remarkably consistent template: initial contact and transport, a physical examination, often involving instruments applied to the skull, the spine, the reproductive organs, some form of communication, either verbal or what witnesses consistently describe as a transmission of imagery directly into the mind, and then return. But certain accounts describe a deviation from this sequence, a moment where the procedure pauses, where the beings confer, sometimes physically, sometimes in what witnesses describe as a sustained period of stillness, as though communication is occurring through channels humans cannot perceive. And then something changes. The subject is treated differently afterward, guided to a different area, handled with what some witnesses describe remarkably as greater care, not cruelty, not aggression, but a heightened attentiveness that is somehow more frightening than roughness would have been. A case documented by Brazilian researcher Dr. Julio Aleixo in the early 1980s offers one of the clearest descriptions of this pause. The witness, a truck driver from Minas Gerais whose account Aleixo published in a small Portuguese language journal that received almost no international attention, described being in an examination room with another man he'd never met. During this man's examination, the beings stopped, all of them, simultaneously. For approximately 30 seconds, by the witness's estimation, nothing moved. Nobody spoke. The beings simply held. It was like a photograph, the witness recalled, everything frozen. And then they looked at each other. I don't mean with their eyes, because I'm not sure they have eyes the way we do, but they attended to each other. And then one of them placed its hand on the other man's head, here, pointing to his own temple, and held it there much longer than they'd held it on mine. And after that, the other man was calm. Too calm. Calm like a man who has accepted something. The truck driver went home. The other man was still aboard when he left. What happened during those 30 seconds? And is the pause itself diagnostic? Is it the moment the decision is being made, or the moment it's being communicated? Here is where I have to be honest about the limits of what we know. We are working from the testimony of witnesses who, by definition, were not selected. They survived the encounter, in the sense of being returned, and they are our only sources. Whatever criteria the beings applied, these witnesses failed to meet them, or met them insufficiently, or met some threshold that categorized them as temporary subjects rather than permanent acquisitions. Their perspective is inherently partial, but that partiality is itself revealing, because across multiple accounts from multiple cultures and decades, the returnees described noticing specific things about the individuals who were not returned. And these observations cluster around a remarkably consistent set of characteristics. Age is one. Not exclusively, there are accounts suggesting younger individuals have also been permanently taken, but older subjects, particularly those in the range of 50 to 70 years, appear with disproportionate frequency in these accounts. A detail that initially seemed like coincidence became harder to dismiss when researcher John Carpenter, in a series of hypnotic regression sessions conducted in Missouri between 1989 and 1994, encountered 3 separate clients who independently described seeing older individuals handled with what one described as a kind of reverence, not experimented upon, observed, studied in a different register entirely. This raises a simple but critical question. Is age itself a selection criterion, or is age a proxy for something else the beings are measuring? Rarer and more disturbing are the accounts that focus not on physical characteristics, but on reactivity. How the subject responded during the procedure, specifically how they responded to whatever form of mental or neurological examination the beings conduct. A number of witnesses describe subjects who, during this phase, exhibited unusual responses, convulsions in one account, a sustained period of what the witness called speaking in a language I've never heard, in another, and in at least 2 separate cases from unconnected sources, a condition where the subject appeared to communicate back with the beings in some legible way. One of these cases comes from a 1993 MUFON field report from rural Idaho, filed by a field investigator named only as T. Haskins. The witness, a woman in her mid-30s, reported an experience involving at least 3 other individuals, one of whom, a teenage boy, reacted to the being's examination in a way she described as electric. "They touched him and he lit up," she said. "That's the only way I can say it. Like they'd completed a circuit, and they all of them, every being in that room, they turned toward him at the same time. Every single one, like a flower turning to sun. And I thought, they found what they were looking for." The boy was not with her when she regained consciousness outside her home at approximately 4 a.m. The field report is notable for what Haskins included as an addendum. Subject reports have now identified 3 separate Idaho cases within an 18-month period involving missing teenagers who vanished under circumstances with no physical evidence. Correlation unverified, correlation noted. Let's talk about what witnesses say happens in the minutes, or what feels like minutes, before the separation occurs. Not the physical characteristics of who is taken, the behaviour, because the behavioural cues, once you start looking for them across accounts, coalesce into something that resembles a protocol, a checklist being administered. And the moment the checklist produces a particular outcome, the procedure changes. Q1, the repeated examination. In accounts where a subject was ultimately separated from the group, witnesses consistently describe those individuals being examined more than once, returned to the table, subjected to the same, or an intensified version of the same, instrument or procedure. Temporary subjects, by contrast, appear to go through the examination once, sometimes twice. The subjects who are ultimately separated go through it 3, 4, 5 times, as though the beings are confirming a reading, verifying a result. Q2, direct eye contact. This appears across accounts with enough frequency to warrant attention. Beings who are described as clinically impersonal during standard examinations, detached, efficient, expressionless, are reported to make sustained, deliberate eye contact with certain subjects. Not a glance, a sustained gaze. A woman who filed a report with the British UFO Research Association in 1986 described this with a precision I found chilling. "The one standing at my left, he looked at the man across from me, really looked at him, the way you look at something you intend to keep." Q3, the cessation of communication. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive detail. In many standard abduction accounts, beings communicate with subjects throughout the procedure, reassurances, imagery, explanations of a kind. But in accounts where a subject was ultimately retained, multiple witnesses describe communication stopping at a certain point, as though once the decision was made, the pretense of dialogue was no longer necessary. The retained subject was no longer being managed, they were simply being held. The one they kept recalled a witness in a 1979 account documented by researcher Richard Hall and filed in the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena Archives. He stopped talking to them at some point, or they stopped talking to him. Whichever it was, something ended, and after that he looked like a man who had stopped trying. Is the cessation of communication the moment of selection? Or is it the announcement of a selection already made? The most disturbing testimony in this entire investigation isn't about what the beings do, it's about what the retained subjects do. Several witnesses described the permanently taken individuals as appearing, in their final moments aboard, not terrified, not struggling, not pleading, something else entirely. A retired schoolteacher from rural Queensland, Australia, whose case was documented in 1991 by researcher Bill Chalker, buried in a footnote of his privately circulated research notes rather than his published work, described watching a woman she'd spoken with briefly in the holding area be guided through a doorway that the others did not pass through, and the schoolteacher's recollection of the retained woman's expression is something I've turned over in my mind many times since reading it. She looked at me just before they took her through, and I expected fear, wouldn't you? But it wasn't fear. It was something more like recognition. Like she'd always known this was coming. Like she was remembering something she'd forgotten. Is this the product of whatever neurological procedure the beings perform, a kind of chemical or neurological pacification? Or is it possible that communication occurs at a deeper level with retained subjects, that they are told something, shown something, given some context that the temporary subjects are deliberately withheld? Another account, this one from a 1984 case in rural Minnesota, documented by a researcher named Walter Andrus in an internal MUFON memo, describes a witness watching a retained man actually turn back toward the group of temporary subjects before being guided out. He didn't speak. He simply raised his hand, not a wave, more like an acknowledgement, and then turned back and walked through the corridor willingly. Willingly. What do you do with that? The deeper I went into these accounts, the more that word kept surfacing. Willingly. Not all of them. Some accounts describe individuals who resisted, who had to be physically guided, who called out to the other witnesses. But a statistically notable number of the last moment descriptions include some version of acceptance, compliance, as though the being kept had in those final minutes been brought to an understanding that the temporary subjects had not. And this raises a question I genuinely cannot resolve. Is the selection something done to these individuals, or is it something they, at some level of consciousness, the beings can access, and humans normally cannot, agree to? I'd be negligent if I didn't address what should be the most obvious empirical question in this entire investigation. If people are being permanently taken, where are the missing persons reports? The answer, and I want to be careful here because this is where skepticism is not just appropriate but necessary, is complicated. Most individuals reported as abductees who subsequently disappear are categorized under standard missing persons classifications. Runaway adults, voluntary departures, cases where evidence of foul play is absent get deprioritized. The connection to prior UFO or anomalous experience is rarely, if ever, entered into official documentation. Not because of deliberate suppression necessarily, though that possibility shouldn't be dismissed entirely, but because the institutional framework for connecting those dots simply doesn't exist. There's no checkbox on a missing persons report for individual previously claimed to have been abducted by non-human beings, but some researchers have tried to make those connections anyway, and what they found is, at minimum, worth examining. In the late 1980s, a small research group operating out of New England, unnamed in the documents I reviewed, referred to only as the Northeast Coalition in correspondence, began cross-referencing MUFON case files with regional missing persons records. Their methodology was imperfect, their sample was small, but their preliminary findings, circulated in a mimeographed report dated approximately 1991 that I located through a private archive, suggested that individuals who had reported abduction experiences had a statistically elevated rate of subsequent unexplained disappearance compared to the general population. The report was never published. The coalition appears to have dissolved sometime in the early 1990s. The original data, if it still exists, has not surfaced publicly. The silence around this research is deafening. This raises a simple but critical question, not whether the findings were accurate, but why the effort to make these connections has remained so fragmentary, so underfunded, so persistently deprioritized. If the correlation is spurious, the research should easily disprove itself. So why hasn't it been disproven? Why hasn't anyone with institutional resources bothered to disprove it? One of the more intellectually rigorous attempts to theorize about the selection process comes from a researcher I'll call Dr. C, a former academic in a cognitive sciences field who began studying abduction testimony in the late 1980s after encountering a case among his own patients and spent the next decade conducting what he described as the most unsettling research of my career. His notes, shared with a small number of colleagues before his death in 2003, were preserved and eventually made available through a private research foundation. Dr. C proposed what he called a categorization model for understanding the being's selection process. He was careful, sometimes maddeningly so, to frame everything as hypothesis. But his central argument was this: the beings, whatever they are, appear to interact with human subjects not as individuals but as specimens within a taxonomy. They are conducting, he argued, something functionally analogous to a natural history survey. Most humans are observed, documented and released, the equivalent of a field biologist tagging and releasing an animal for tracking purposes. But certain individuals, those who exhibit particular characteristics or who represent in the being's assessment a category of sufficient rarity or value, are retained for permanent study. The analogy he returned to repeatedly, and which I find genuinely useful, however disturbing its implications, is that of a museum collection. A naturalist in the field photographs hundreds of specimens, but certain specimens, for reasons internal to the naturalist's research agenda, are collected, preserved, kept. The troubling implication, Dr. C wrote in a passage that has stayed with me, is not that this process is cruel. It may not be cruel at all by any standard the beings apply. The troubling implication is that it is taxonomic, that the selected individuals are not being harmed in any sense. The beings recognize they are being categorized finally and permanently at a level of precision that temporary field observation cannot achieve. They have been identified as exemplars, and exemplars in any serious collection are not returned to the wild. The word wild landed on me like a cold hand. That's how we are categorized in this model, the wild, the place where the temporary subjects get to go back to. Here's the strangest part, and I want to say this carefully, because it's the element that most clearly crosses from documented testimony into the territory of pattern recognition, which is where I always try to slow down and ask myself whether I'm seeing something real or constructing something from noise. But the pattern repeats with unsettling precision. In account after account, across different countries, different decades, different languages, different cultural contexts, the witnesses who return describe a specific sequence around the moment of permanent separation. There is the procedural pause, there is the intensified examination, there is the eye contact or its cessation, and then there is what I've come to think of as the reorientation, a moment in which the retained individual is physically moved, not to leave the room, but within it, guided from one position to another, as though they are being relocated within the space in a way that carries significance. In MR's account from Ohio, guided to a different corridor. In the Brazilian truck driver's account, moved to the far side of the room. In the 1986 Bufora account, taken to a raised platform that the witness had previously not noticed. In a 1994 case from rural France, documented by French researcher Thierry Garnier, in a publication with a circulation of fewer than 200 copies. They brought him to stand in a particular place, a particular spot, as though the spot itself mattered, as though they were placing him in a frame. Placing him in a frame, I've thought about that phrase more than I can say. Is the physical repositioning within the space itself significant? Is it practical? Are they moving the retained subject to a position from which extraction to a different part of the vessel is more efficient? Or is it, as Garnier's witness intuited, something more like a designation, a marking, the moment a specimen is moved from the collection tray to the permanent case? Once you see this pattern, you cannot unsee it. I want to return to something I touched on earlier, because I think it's the most philosophically significant and least examined dimension of all of this. The question of whether the retained individuals know what is happening and whether at some level they participate in it. The accounts that haunt me most are not the ones involving terror or resistance. The ones that haunt me are the ones involving that expression the Queensland schoolteacher described. Recognition, as though she'd always known. There is a subcategory of abduction testimony, not large, not widely discussed, genuinely obscure, in which the abductee reports being shown imagery of other humans who appear to be living, in some functional sense, in a non-terrestrial environment, not imprisoned, not in visible distress, present, engaged with their surroundings in ways that suggest, however improbably, accommodation. A woman in a 1988 account from rural Oregon, whose testimony was recorded by a researcher affiliated with the Center for UFO Studies before being quietly archived rather than published, described being shown what she called a room with humans in it, but not our room, not our time. She described the individuals there as appearing calm, purposeful, as though they had been there long enough to have developed routines. Did she witness the permanent acquisitions adapted to their new context? Or was she being shown fabricated imagery, a management tool the beings use to pacify witnesses before returning them? And if the latter, why bother? Why manage the emotional response of individuals you're about to return anyway? The evidence suggests something much larger than simple abduction and retention. It suggests a possibility that is, in some ways, more disturbing than captivity. That the permanently taken may have been, at some deep level of consciousness, selected with their own participation. That the beings can access a layer of human awareness at which a kind of agreement becomes possible. An agreement the conscious mind, upon return, cannot remember making. An agreement the retained individuals, by the time they pass through that final corridor, have already made. And if that's even partially true, if the separation is not purely imposed but in some sense recognized at a level below what we consciously control, then the entire moral architecture of this subject shifts. It doesn't make it less disturbing. It may make it more. Let me try to reason backward from what we have. If there is a selection process, and the consistency of testimony across so many accounts makes the null hypothesis increasingly difficult to maintain, then what does that process tell us about the beings conducting it? They operate with criteria. Whatever those criteria are, they are applied systematically and, to the extent we can judge from witness testimony, consistently. The pause, the intensified examination, the reorientation, these appear to be procedural, not improvised, which implies institutional knowledge, a protocol developed over time and applied with precision. This is not the behavior of beings acting randomly or opportunistically. This is the behavior of beings with a program. The program appears to involve long-term observation at minimum and permanent acquisition at its upper extreme. The distribution between these two outcomes, how many temporary versus how many permanent, is, as I noted at the beginning, unknowable. But even a small percentage of permanence applied across the thousands of documented cases and the presumably far larger number of undocumented ones produces a number that should disturb anyone willing to sit with it. The decision is made, apparently, on the spot, within the span of a single encounter. The beings assess, confirm, and act within what witnesses estimate as minutes. This implies either extraordinarily refined diagnostic instruments or an accumulated prior knowledge about the specific individual that informs a rapid determination, or both. And here is where the official explanation, such as it is, breaks down entirely. Because the mass psychosis model, the sleep paralysis model, the false memory model, none of these accounts for the cross-cultural, cross-decade